Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Thank you all so much for your patience and for sticking in there with us. I know we're a few minutes running behind, but also we know time is a concept of whiteness. So what is it? I raised this up, and I am with Women and Children First, the bookstore. We are one of 3 remaining feminist bookstores in the country that is fully owned and operated by women, which is something that we are incredibly proud about. And we want to welcome you all to this virtual event the same way we would in our store by acknowledging the land that we sit on. Our bookstore stands on occupied unceded territory of the Peoria, the Potawatomi, Miami, and Sioux people. We urge you to learn more about land acknowledgement and the rightful owner of the land where you are viewing tonight's event at native-land.ca. Additionally, beyond land acknowledgement, you can find yourself supporting your local grassroots Native initiatives and movements. If you are in the Chicagoland area, American Indian Center Chicago is a great place to start. We will also share the link to that site in our chat box. So thank you for that. If you haven't already purchased tonight's book, We Will Not Cancel Us, you can do so by ordering online at womenchildrenfirst.com. You can receive your book via curbside pickup, or we can ship to anywhere in the continental U.S. We've added a shortcut to purchasing this book, which is the Buy the Book button, which is the icon that you will see on your screen. Our website will also provide a calendar of our upcoming events. One event that is currently getting a lot of buzz already is on January 7th, and it's the event with Devon Price, author of Laziness Does Not Exist. So feel free to check that out as well. Now, as for our event tonight, we are uber excited to have Adrienne Marie Brown, my fellow Illinois Wesleyan alum Charlene Carruthers, and Cindy Wiesner. I'll introduce them and then turn the floor over to them. At any point during the conversation, please feel free to ask any questions you have to our panelists by using the chat bar, okay? So, We Will Not Cancel Us. Whew, a very provocative read. Which is no surprise to me given the controversy it began in. I remember sitting on my couch, minding my quarantine business on July 17th when I got an Instagram notification that Adrienne Marie Brown has posted. Little did I know, I was walking into the internet fire. With one post, I was seeing more exclamation points, the emoji with the steam coming out of his nose. I saw babies crying. Like, it was so much energy being given to this one post. I too wound up upset just because I felt like it was a loot. Like, it was just so much happening around this one post. So much so that it became a book. A book that I am still highlighting and I'm flagging, as you all can tell at the top. And I have my notes and my markers, and I'm just like, what does this mean? It's also a book that I experience heavy disagreement with in some moments and then find joy in other moments. I think that this book is one of my favorite books so far of 2020 because it truly feels like a conversation, and I don't see much of conversations happening as of late. So I really encourage you all, if you haven't bought the book, to buy it. So, intro to our speakers. Adrienne Marie Brown is the author of We Will Not Cancel Us and Other Dreams of Transformative Justice, Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Shaping Worlds, and co-editor of Octavia's Roots, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements. She is the co-host of the How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia's Parables podcast. Adrienne is rooted in my wonderful hometown, Detroit. And Charlene A. Carruthers is a Black queer feminist community organizer and writer with over 15 years of experience in racial justice. So you check your life, okay? Feminist and youth leadership development movement work. Charlene served as the founding national director of BYP 100 and is the founder and executive director of the Chicago Center for Leadership and Transformation. She is also the author of Unapologetic, a Black, queer, and feminist mandate for radical movements, which you also can purchase at womenandchildrenfirst.com. Charlene was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, where she currently resides. Cindy Wiesner is the executive director of the Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. She's been active in many movement building initiatives, including the U.S. Social Reform, World March of Women, It Takes Roots, the Rising Majority, Green New Deal Network, and the People's Bailout. She is currently volunteering with the Frontline. Cindy is a lesbian of Salvadorian, Colombian, and German descent, and a grassroots feminist, internationalist, and movement strategist. She currently lives in Durham, North Carolina. Okay, folks, so here you have it. Adrienne Maree Brown, Charlene Carruthers, and Cindy Wiesner. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us. Thank you for that intro. I love that. You're like, it's been lit. So I really appreciate you reading and engaging. And Cindy, Charlene, I can't even express actually how deeply I want to be sitting in a room with you, like so deeply. I literally had a dream recently where both of you, amongst others, were running towards me with open arms. And it was like the moment of, we were like running towards each other, like, and I was like, oh yes, it literally was like that. It was so, and like we never reached each other. Like all these people, my sister, all these people were like running towards each other. And I was like, all right, we're not there yet, but we're here. So I just wanted to ask everyone who is here to just take a moment and let's ground ourselves in this moment, this conversation. And I always start with the breath. Just take a deep breath in and let it out. And keep doing that. Taking it in, letting it back out. And notice that you're here right now. You could be a lot of different places. You're here by choice. And you're here in a conversation that is not the beginning or the end of a conversation. It's just an exploration of some ideas that feel really relevant for those of us who are trying to change the world. So just ground in like, oh yeah, I'm a part of this conversation. And the three of us are going to speak for a bit amongst each other, bring ourselves into the conversation and share with each other. And then we are going to have a Q&A. There's an ask a question. So there's a Q&A box. And so you can ask questions in that space. And I believe you can kind of upvote if you like a certain question. So even if you don't want to add one, you might pick what we talk about. So we're going to try to balance between our conversation and widening the conversation. And I just ask you, what I keep asking people with this book is like, wherever you are in relationship to it, like open to the idea that this conversation could change what's possible for us inside of movement. That's the goal, is to feel like more becomes possible because we engage with each other here. So let's start with who we are. So my name is Adrienne Maree Brown. I use she and they pronouns. I am based in Detroit and happily sitting in Detroit. For years, I've been like, I pay rent in Detroit. I wave at Detroit from the plane. And now I'm actually here for the longest time I've been here continuously and with no end in sight. So I'm just in Detroit. And I wanted to share a bit of like movement lineage, like where I enter into this. So my politicization began with the Harm Reduction Coalition. And in terms of like formal movement worker work. So before that, it was when Amadou Diallo was killed. I started doing police, resisting police organizing, then harm reduction work with sex workers and active drug users, and like, how do we stop judging each other and start really meeting the needs? And I want to lay that in because that feels like a foundational thing to all other movement work I do, is what does it look like if we let go of judgment, understand that we are inside of a larger system, that we're all trying to survive, and be with what is and find the best way to move forward inside of that. I did electoral organizing for a period of my life, and I was like, that's not right for me. I went and did direct action work for a period of my life. I loved it. I feel like it's for me and for everyone. And then I went to work on the U.S. Social Forum, and I really got a sense of what does it mean to take things to scale, to even begin to imagine a movement at the scale that it needs to be for the justice that we want. And then I have spent a lot of my time since then facilitating. So really moving out of being in formal roles and me putting myself in the role of facilitation and mediation. So that's a little bit about where I enter the conversation. Charlene A. Carruthers, could you bring yourself in? Hi, I hear you. I don't hear you.
Oh, hi.
Now
hi,
I hear
everyone. Awesome. Hey, y'all. I am Charlene. I use she and her pronouns, and I am here in Chicago, joining y'all from Chicago. I'm so glad that Adrienne gave me consent to eat during this call because it's 7 p.m. Central Time. I'm so glad for the non-East Coast supremacy in this moment. I come to movement work doing racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, LGBTQ justice stuff here in the US and across the country. So I'm just glad to be in this conversation and in many ways because this idea, we will not cancel us, is something that I've come up against over and over again in the past 15 years or so of doing movement work. And I consider myself to be in this conversation with the OG, Cindy Wiesner, who I know is going to come up next. I'm like, let me listen to what you have to say, because there's so much to learn in these book conversations. And this might be the most fun I'll have during the book event ever. So thanks for having me.
Cindy, my love. Cindy Wiesner, bring yourself in.
All right. First, I want to start off with a cheers. Adrienne Marie gave us consent to bring a little beverage of choice. So cheers to everybody as folks are eating and joining us this evening. So saludos to everyone. My name is Cindy Wiesner. I go by she and her, as you heard in the introductions. The current Executive Director of Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. And yeah, just a little bit about myself. You know, my mom is from El Salvador. My dad was Colombian and German. And I was born in the working class part of Hollywood, California. And for most of my life, my mom was a domestic worker and a single mama. My dad was killed in Colombia when I was very young. So I have no other siblings that I know of. And yeah, and I think for me, when I think about sort of my moment of consciousness was in 1991 in the first Iraqi massacre, as you know, bombs were being by Bush Sr., if many of you may remember, and then. Soon after that, like 2 years later, I was part of the, Rodney King uprisings in 1993, when all those cops in LA got acquitted. And I was part of a political formation called Roots Against War in the Bay Area, which was people of color against the war at home and the war abroad. And in a lot of ways, it's like such a interesting, sort of cycle of time to be in this moment of the most massive uprisings for and defense of Black lives, in the moment of a pandemic, in the moment of war and occupation and militarization deep in our communities. And so I got politicized by an organization, a cadre organization that we started called STORM. Standing together to organize a revolutionary movement. And it was a short-lived organization, but it actually had a lot of impact on my life and actually a lot of impact on a lot of people that were part of STORM. And I think I'm going to mention it because I think it was important in terms of when I started thinking about your book and I started thinking about what sort of formed me. It was that political training, and I'll share a little bit more later. But I got trained by C2, the Center for Third World Organizing, and the AFL-CIO. I went on to build independent worker centers, both in the Bay Area and in Miami. And as I got to work with the brilliance of Adrienne and so many other organizers across the country on the US Social Forum, both in Atlanta and in Detroit. And And I've been part of building many organizations and helping start many organizations. And I consider myself a feminist, an internationalist, a Marxist. And in a lot of ways, that has been kind of formative for me in the last like 25, 30 years. And it informs the way I understand the world and the way I actually am in the world. And I think I'll share a little bit more about how that sort of political training and that philosophical sort of worldview actually gets at some of the issues that you bring up in the book and some of the issues that we see happen in our movement.
Beautiful. Thank you for that. Thank you both for that. You know, I'll say the two of you, when I was working on the book, and even when I was initially writing the first piece, I had in mind like the you two and a few other folks, many of whom are involved in like blurbing or editing or writing or whatever. I was like, these are people that I deeply trust politically. Like, I've seen you work. I know that you work to be very accountable yourselves. And I know that you work to stay in relationship with people that's realistic, right? That you're like, I'm going to be accountable. I'm not going to walk around terrified to speak. I'm going to be honest about what's going on. And I knew that we could have a real conversation. It wouldn't just be a yes conversation. It's like, yeah, Adrienne girl, yes, everything, yes. I was like, no, I want to have real conversations with people who are in different movement locations around these ideas and around what's happening. So I'll just say for folks who are like just weaving into this or like what's going on, the book started, I wrote an essay in July. I had been away on sabbatical for 6 months. And I had gone away really intentionally. Like, I've done a ton of things in movement. I've been fingers in every pie, and I just need to like rest. And I need to recuperate, and I need to take stock of what have I been putting out, what's coming in. And so I came back, and when I came back, especially the last part of it, I was off of social media mostly and just like really away. And when I came back in, it felt so clear to me that something like the toxicity of movement that I had been like kind of normalized to was so sharp and so intense when I returned. I was like, how did we get here? What is happening? And oh, the audio is still echoing. Maybe try, let me see what happens. Are y'all muted now? Okay. Does it still happen when they're muted? We will wait to see if it's still muted. All right, we'll see. One other thing that they've told us is putting on headphones seems to help. All right, cool. So when I stepped back in, it was like this toxicity feels like really intense. And what are we going to do about that? What do I do about that? What's my role as someone who's a facilitator and a mediator? And I get called. So people call me. They're like, this just happened. We need you to hold it. We need you to fix it. We need you to point us to someone who can hold it. Or because I have some platform, we need you to join us in canceling this person, calling this person out, doing this, doing this, doing this. And I was like, I don't know. I don't know most of these people. I'm like, I don't know the people we're talking about calling out. I don't know the people who are asking me to call them out or cancel them. I don't know the people who are calling me asking for help. And so then I'm like, okay, the way I understand abolition is it's this larger picture of how do we end the cycles of policing and the carceral system, prison system. And then I tie that into my personal practice of transformative justice, which is like, so that means I have to notice where I am policing, notice where I want to dispose of someone, and I have to figure out what are other options. Boundaries, a clear conversation and accountability process, like what is it? And what I saw and what I continue to see is people are punishing each other publicly and seeming to really enjoy it. And that enjoying it part is scary to me. I'm like, there's sometimes when every other option has been tried. This doesn't seem to be the case in a lot of what I'm being called towards right now. And then on the other side, I'm noticing that people are really scared of being honest, especially if they've made a mistake, people are really scared to just speak up in public. And I started noticing this as social media came into, you know, because I think we all have some experience of organizing before social media was like the center of a lot of the world, and now seeing this. And so I'm like, oh, as someone who's has not lived with social media my whole organizing life, I remember when it was like we would get mad at each other, and there might be a letter that went around, and there might be some other things that happened, but it wasn't this like, now everyone in the entire universe has to be up on this mistake and how it's being handled and everything about it. And starting to hear from movement people, I'm scared to speak up. I can't say that. I mean, obviously we can't say that. When they're talking about saying the truth, whatever the truth may be, I'm like, why? Because then we might be treated the same way the worst harm doer, the worst abuser is treated. There's no nuance in the response. That made me curious. So I wrote this piece, and I also, I have to say, when I wrote the piece, I was in a very passionate place, and I was like, you know, I have a new perspective because I've been away and I can see this thing. And so I wrote a very passionate piece. And I got some feedback on it before I posted it. People were like, it's great. This is a super necessary intervention. Do it. Posted it. And the initial feedback, I got like 13,000 yeses from people that were like, thank God you wrote this. We need this. And then the other side of feedback started coming in where people were like, no. Here's what we don't like about this. We don't like the metaphors you chose. We don't think it's clear enough where you stand on survivors. We don't think this is clear enough. We don't think that's clear enough. You did the same thing. You collapsed everything. And I will say it took me a while to really like process what it felt like. And it felt really important to me as a political experiment or an experience, not experiment, experience. Because generally I'm likable. Like I'm a facilitator. My role is to be neutral and generally likable enough that people will like move with me along a process in a room. So I politically have not taken highly controversial perspectives, I think. And so I've never had this experience of people being like, we hate you, you're a liberal, like the whole thing. I was like, what? Wow. And I also feel like I was in a position to take the risk, right? Because I'm like, you know, people may talk about me behind my back, but to my face, people are generally like, okay, we're okay with you, right? So I was like, if I have that position, I can take this risk in a way that some other people might not be able to. And to me, it's what being a leader, I think, means, is you have to be willing to take risks. So the only other thing I want to say before, and I'm going to read a little piece of this, and then I have some questions for y'all, is I'm in a real inquiry because the process I went through with the writing of it was a microcosm for me of the thing I'm trying to learn about, which was there was a backlash, but then I committed to learning. I was like, okay, what is in this that I'm missing? What do I need to hear? What do I need to learn? What do I need to understand? And a lot of people have given me the room, right, to do that learning and seeking understanding. What got published in this book, I think, is wildly different from what was initially published. And I left up the original piece as archival material because it actually feels important to me that people see what happens when you receive feedback and when you get in those conversations and when something actually changes publicly. Not to erase the past self, not to erase the mistaken self, not to erase my flaws and where I caused harm and what I needed to apologize for and all of it, but to actually keep the record. So you may or may not be hearing any of the things I'm saying because the video is frozen. However, the thing I am committed to in this conversation is how do we grow? And in this moment, I think we have to take seriously that we're living inside of a very hyper-toxic culture. Like we are movement inside of a toxic cultural moment. Right? So social media is toxic, patriarchy is toxic, capitalism is toxic, the administration is a toxic force. Like there's all these spaces that are hyper toxic spaces, and we're trying to move through that. And we're not Pollyanna, we're not Snow White, we're not like someone like like no, we're like human beings. All those systems are in us, outside of us, and around us. And so my question is, then how do we grow something that's more compelling than punitive culture? How do we grow abolitionist practices that feel doable, that feel practicable, that feel livable? So one of the things I found was mushrooms. Mushrooms, which I recommend doing mushrooms. It would totally change your perspective on so many things. But in this instance, I'm talking about just how mushrooms grow. And they're our teacher from nature. So mushrooms are a great teacher in this recentering work that we're trying to do. One of our oldest ancestors, mycelium and mushrooms, show us that the instance of life we can witness, the mushroom, is always evidence of a much more complex and wider network of connections underground. The same thing is true of conflict and harm. We are all connected to each other at our best and at our worst. The instances of visible dissonance, harm, and abuse in movement are evidence of toxicity in our intersecting systems of identity, belonging, resources, power, and home. One toxic substance is supremacy, so ubiquitous that it has long been invisible to those benefiting from it and can seem desirable to those suffering from it. It manifests as white supremacy, male supremacy, ableist supremacy, straight supremacy, cis supremacy, and more. The belief that some of us are normal and are better, and others, and are justified to take and do whatever we want, including harm each other and the earth. We won't end the systemic patterns of harm by isolating and picking off individuals, just as we can't limit the communicative power of mycelium by plucking a single mushroom from the dirt. We need to flood the entire system with life-affirming principles and practices to clear the channels between us of the toxicity of supremacy, to heal from the harms of a legacy of devaluing some lives and needs in order to indulge others. Mycelium looks much the same way our brains look, networks of data, communication, nourishment flowing in every direction. Mycelium can help us learn how to process conflict and harm into life and beauty. Mycelium helps us to see ourselves. For the pieces in this booklet, I considered working with the metaphors of mushrooms, swarms of wasps, packs of hyena, zombified ants, piranha. Initially, I chose to look directly at our own behavior because we too are networked nature. I looked at metaphors from human history that demonstrate ways that we are unique amongst every other species we know in terms of how we reason and communicate, but stay committed to gleeful vengeance and collective punishment. But in this book, I've upgraded those metaphors and I include explanation as to why. I'm asking you in this introduction to keep on your mycelial glasses as you move through this text, and the same thing through this conversation. Feel for any and all teachers in nature who can help us know what we do not yet know. So that's some thoughts from me. I think one other thing to say about the book is the sections of the book. There's an intro, and then there's a whole section called Learning and Untangling in Public, Bringing Abolition Home, where I talk about the lessons I learned from publishing the piece, including really needing to make a clearer distinction between the kinds of things that people are calling each other out for. So there's distinctions between abuse, conflict, harm, critique, contradiction, misunderstanding, and mistake. Those were all the ones that I was able to pull apart, because I'm like, those actually all deserve different responses. They shouldn't all be receiving the same energy. So, lots of words. So, Cindy, Charlene, the thing I want to ask you first is, something about this call to abolitionist practice resonated with you enough for you to be willing to blurb the book. And I wanted to ask you what parts of it felt like, yeah, this resonates with me. This resonates with what I want to call for and practice.
Okay. Well, this is an uncomfortable book to read for me in many ways, because I could not read this without thinking about my own life. I don't understand, for me, I can read books. I'm reading the Bridgerton series right now. Shout out to Shonda Rhimes. And I don't think about my own life in that way. But reading this requires me to reflect, at least for me, it required me to reflect back on my own experiences in movement, how I've been with other people, how other people have been with me. And really at least begin to, or continue to, because like you said, it's not the beginning of a conversation, to continue to take stock of how I've shown up and ways that I still feel hurt, ways that I think, oh, I hurt someone else. Or even when that person was the person who was like most widely known as doing a thing, like still like, how did I show up in that? And so for me, all good as I understand and what's proven to me over and over again is that relationships are one of, if not the smallest unit of organizing outside of you as an individual. And so I had to think about how I related to other people. And the question, the condition of, the spirit of relationality is something that I'm thinking about all the time now. I just went back to school this fall and, being trained to be a Black Studies scholar. And I'm coming into it as an organizer and also as already like political theorist outside of the academy. And when I pick up this book, it allows me to fill in some of the questions, even if it's not necessarily the gaps. I think it gaps too in the things that consistently come up. And I think the invitation, or not just I think, the invitation into asking questions, particularly in the Bringing Abolition Home chapter, where you ask, can we be principled and discerning in movement conflict? Can we be abolitionists with each other? And I'm just going to read those two because there's two more. But what I find to be also compelling about this is it doesn't say all the time, forever, in all ways. But can we work towards being principled and discerning in movement conflict? Can that become like the way that we want to be with each other? Because if anybody is interested in transforming both themselves and the world that we live in, if you believe in abolition as a long-term strategic political campaign and vision, then we're not going to get there overnight. It's not going to happen in one shot. We're going to mess up. It's going to happen. But can we, even in those moments of when we are messing up, can we own that? Can we be discerning about what is happening? And then you take us through like your own moments of like wondering, am I just afraid right now? Am I terrified right now? Am I angry right now? And one of the things, and you mentioned Black Organizer for Leadership and Dignity in the text, one of the things that I learned through BOLD, which is the acronym, is that like how like many of the ways that we respond to trauma or we respond to violence are ways that have been conditioned in many parts of our lives, different stages of our lives, in service of protecting us, in service of our survival. And for me, I dissociate. I'm like a little turtle. Like I'll run away from the thing. Like that's the thing. Like I'll block something. Like I don't watch videos of violence against people because it just messes me up. I can't do it. So I dissociate. I move away from things. And this work of abolition gives us an opportunity to, and the way you're framing it in this book, it gives us an opportunity to just notice where we are. Notice where we are in our bodies. And through a greater sense of awareness of what we're embodying and how we're showing up, then we can then be with each other in different ways. And if we want to transform this world, I think there are historical examples and there are contemporary examples of how we are with each other that can serve us well for the kind of futures we want to build. And now is the time to start practicing it. Like, I don't want to we could wake up tomorrow and all the prisons and police and the jails are just gone. But guess what won't be gone? Our collective inability to actually reconcile our differences or learn how to talk to each other, because some of us still talk outside of our necks to each other. And so all of those things, like how are we going to be with each other? And I think that you offer us a number of questions and then also vulnerabilities that allow us to think about that allow me to think about how I'm showing up as an organizer and also, frankly, as a scholar.
Thank you. I really Yeah, I'm really like, ah. My system feels very enlivened by whenever you speak. And two of the things that you said that I wanted to just uplift. One is talking about principled struggle, which I remember being in a room with you when you were like, what's principled struggle mean? Say it more specifically. And I remember what Tanya Lee taught us. And really, a lot of this book is about what I think of as the second sort of principle of principled struggle, in the Marxist tradition, is you have to be responsible for your own feelings and actions inside of principled struggle. And what I feel so often happening with this is we're outsourcing. It's like we're outsourcing the responsibility to somewhere else. And we're outsourcing even the problems and the people to somewhere else. And I'm like, that's fine. As a survivor, I'm like, I need the boundary. I need someone else to handle the person who's caused harm to me. But as a community, it's like, where in the community does that need to go? And then the second thing is talking about the abolitionist commitment. I've done a lot of interviews around the book now, and people keep being like, yeah, what about J.K. Rowling? What about R. Kelly? And I'm like, totally. Like, I'm talking about abolitionists to start with, right? I'm an abolitionist for all. I believe in that we need to get rid of the system completely. And the question people always ask is, but what about the worst people? And I'm like, we got to figure that out. But if we can't even figure out our comrades, how do we get to that? How do we get to answer that question? If we can't figure it out amongst people who are say publicly we commit to abolition, but then in our practice we're practicing something else. And this is not just movement people. Everyone is in the, contradiction is the American way. But I also feel like, we talk about democracy, but we don't practice governance. Like, we talk about so many things that we don't practice. So this is just one of them. And I think that this is one that I'm like, that's who the book is for. So I keep carving. I'm like, this is for people who are dedicated to abolition. I'm asking, what are we doing that invites other people to come towards abolition and be like, oh, I could be a whole person inside of that future? Because I don't see it right now. So, Cindy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Like, what's resonating with you?
All right. Can you all hear me? Yeah? All right. So one, I want to start I'm super honored to be in this conversation with you, Charlene and Adrienne. I follow you all's work, read your books, and get to do movement work with you. I also just want to shout out Women and Children First. I love feminist bookstores. There needs to be many more. And I also want to just bring into the space a sister comrade of ours that just passed away, Leaf Mullings, who actually, in preparation for today, I thought about her. I have my candle lit for her in front of my computer right now, who passed away, who really, in a lot of ways, embodies and really like that principled struggle that you talk about in the book. So one, I just want to appreciate you, my sister compañera Adrienne, because when you wrote this book, I know that you were scared, right? And I think that, to me, there was a level of vulnerability that you showed and I remember saying, I was like, Adrienne Maree Brown is saying this? I was like, huh. I was like, wow, that was a very bold move. And so I want to appreciate you for that. And I think the question that you are putting forward is a fundamental question. It's provocative, but it's also necessary. And I think when we think about the moment, the political moment, that the conjuncture that in which we're in, right, with the colliding crises, this moment of the pandemic, the global pandemic, this level of disorientation, disconnection that people are feeling, the growing racist, patriarchal authoritarianism globally, and in a lot of ways, this realignment of left forces, right? That many of us are experimenting with new tactics and things that we have not necessarily done. Amidst all of this, it gives an opportunity to bring in a lot of conflict, a lot of confrontation, a lot of confusion, and a lot of just frankly political difference and understanding of the moment, right? And that's going to happen within our organizations, within our communities, within our families, within our partnerships, within our movements, right? And part of this, I just really want to just appreciate how you use mushrooms, well, mushrooms and nature to actually like show as an example, right? How you're calling for this like super radical, compassionate rigor. And I think that those three words are really important. It's like compassionate, it's rigorous, and it's radical, right? And it's asking us to do something dramatically different in how we deal with harm and hurt. Because you know what? We are always going to disappoint each other, right? One way or another. It's like, you didn't say hi to me, or I don't agree with you. You didn't validate my work. You didn't come to my thing. There's going to be disappointment constantly and there's no judgment value on it. But I think that part of it is like, part of the importance is like, what does it mean, to think about principled struggle? But I actually think it's a skill, right? I think it's a skill and a politic that needs to be trained in. And I think that as someone who's trained organizers and leaders, and that's been part of like my work from the very beginning, is that's one of the things that is important, that is not visible within our organizing models, right? And within our political movement culture. But I think you inspire us to create new forms of accountability and not to be punitive. You call out, it's like not be punitive as the state, as the prison industrial complex, as the that we seek to abolish, as this racialized, gendered capitalism. And so for me, one of the things, like, growing up as a working class kid, I was not a standout kid. I was like shy, no talents in particular. And, it's just like, I got exposed to activism at university. I was lucky enough through affirmative action to go to university. I got exposed to political and radical political work in the early 90s. And Marxism, in particular, third world liberation struggles, people like Amílcar Cabral from Guinea-Bissau, Che Guevara, the Sandinista feminists from Nicaragua, more recently, indigenous leaders from the MAS, the movement towards socialism, and so many more, right? Mao, and even Lenin. Many of these things were, big words and big concepts to me. But in a lot of ways, they ended up making a lot of sense. It made me understand my own working class experience, right? It made me understand my mother as a domestic worker. It made me understand my family of carpenters and mechanics and gardeners and seamstresses, right? And how, as immigrants in this country. And part of that is like, when I did leadership development work, it's like started organizing welfare, women on welfare, when TANF, right, was like Clinton sort of changing welfare as we know it, forcing women into work, mamas into work. Doing this work around talking about capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism was really like a liberating sort of exposure to be like, hey, I'm not the fuck up. Like, I'm not the one who got myself into this. There's actually conditions, there's systems, there's institutions, there's culture, there's all this infrastructure that keeps us in this way. And I think that one of the things that for me, that I think has been so instrumental in my development is that from miners in South Africa to landless people in Brazil, taxi drivers to Mexico, domestic workers here in the US, big words and concept actually make a lot of sense and in fact empower us to actually be like, if we're trying to dismantle this system, we become like, the sort of doctors and scientists to then undo what we need to do and heal the world, right? And so part of this training and principle struggle, right, is really important. I was lucky enough to be in a cadre organization where we practice this thing called criticism, self-criticism that comes from Mao, that then the Black Panthers took on and the Young Lords took on, and different movements in this country. And this process of what we renamed reflection and self-reflection, right? And part of that was to be like, there was a level of discipline and rigor that to this day, I think makes me who I am, right? Is like being able to work hard, but also be rigorous and be honest, right? And make assessments and be able to, think about like in any conflict, saying conflict is part of the work. Conflict is always going to be part of the work. And ultimately, we have to think about sort of when shit goes down, how do you then handle it, right? And how do you handle it, right? And so one of the concepts that we learned is, this is a Maoist concept, which was like no investigation, no right to speak. And part of that was like, if something is happening, how do you assess, investigate, take care of the people that are raising the issues, but then how do you deal with it, right? And I think so often, so much of the disappointment in our movement is that people don't deal with it, right? We're complicit in seeing things go wrong. We're complicit in the abuse. We're watching it happen before our eyes, and we don't say it because, you know, some of us is like, oh, that mind your own business. That's not your shit. Don't get involved in that. But I think that that's one of the things that I think this framework really taught us is actually, if we're agents of change, we have to, one, ask the impacted person what they want and what they need, but then you have to act, right? And you have to follow through, and there has to be a level of closure to it. And I think that one of the things that, to me, your book really talks about is like, what does it mean to reimagine being in struggle with each other, where we're not destroying each other, but we're actually building each other up.
Ooh, thank you. This is why I love talking to y'all. You're smart. So much of what you just said resonated. And that last piece, you know, my teacher was Grace Lee Boggs, and she talked about that we must transform ourselves to transform the world, which I take as her take on that dialectical humanism, which I take as her piece on that reflection, self-reflection, because you will continue to change, and we must continue to change, but the front line is actually within us, not only externally. And so that piece feels important to me. And then the second piece, we both look away and are complicit, and what we come up with so far has been unsatisfying. And I think that is fine if we recognize ourselves as at the beginning of this, which is, I included other writing that I've done on transformative justice, because I've been saying this. I'm like, if we look at ourselves as being at the beginning of trying to learn something that as a species we have not figured out at scale, we have not really, you know, if we look at ourselves that way, we can actually be patient. We can actually give ourselves room for the experiment and to be like, oh, that didn't work. Because I think what happens now is people are like, oh, this is it. Now this is the way. What I love is a lot of the people who are leaders in this, Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan put out a workbook, Fumbling Towards Repair. It's an incredible workbook on how to do community accountability process. But even they are like, this is some stuff that we know. This is like, you know, these are some of the things we've learned from the early experimentation. And it's not going to be something where we move from one point to another and suddenly we're just at scale with TJ. It's going to be because all of us choose to behave differently in our most intimate relationships, in our organizing, in any space where we are in movement and think of each other as comrades or compañeras. And it's like these, how do we start to think of everyone as ours? Everyone is ours. And I'm like, I know what my boundary is, and I'm working to not let that be a boundary. You know, I'm like, how do I keep softening that boundary so that I can still see everyone as mine, as part of me? There is no separation. We are all mycelially connected, and one. But then if I just come back into movement, I'm like, okay, I've got to facilitate. Then I'm just like, well, what's the satisfying result here? Because so far, disposing of people so they go into another community and cause harm is not satisfying to me, right? And I'm like, I can't keep helping that happen. You know, removing someone from a platform on social media for whatever period of time we decide is their punishment, and then they come back. I'm not satisfied by that. Did they change? How do we know? Did anything happen? So I feel like emergent strategy and pleasure activism also kind of come together in this for me, as I'm like, am I satisfied? What does nature say? Okay. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I wanted us to see if we have questions from our audience. You can add questions in. And I also have another question, so we'll see what happens here. So what is necessary? Oh, wait, here. Okay. How can we survive and rebuild in our public creation and activism after a failed accountability process? And in this one, the abuser had more power, used it to slander the mediator. It's been 18 months and this person's been quarantined. So how do we survive and rebuild after a failed accountability process? I'm like, this is what I'm talking. This is a little bit of what I feel like I was just speaking on is
Yeah.
a lot of these processes are actually really unsatisfying. And a lot of them do quote unquote fail, right? Charlene?
Yeah. It's taken me to a place of like, what would it take for us to be clear and able to develop conditions of satisfaction in the wake of harm, abuse, and violence? And I don't even know, I can't sit here and say that I could tell you exactly what it is that is going to satisfy me after someone has hurt me, after someone has abused me, or someone has like assaulted me or something. Like there's a spectrum of things that one can experience along conflict, harm, abuse, all of these things. And so I guess I would come back with even more questions. It's like, what is it that you need in order to feel like you can be in your full dignity as an individual?
That's right.
And what is it that you need if you are still involved and you want to be involved in activism? What is it that you need to re-enter or to be there and also still be within your full dignity? Is that possible completely separate from the individuals who were involved in the process? The answer to that may be yes, no, or maybe so. And I'm really answering this question and thinking about my own life and situations that I've been in.
Yeah.
And it's like sometimes I've actually just been real silent on some wild shit that has gone down. And it's like I've taken my silence as like, oh, I didn't do any harm. But actually, no, I didn't help the situation. And I didn't think about like, what is my condition of satisfaction of being in this community? What am I going to need so that every time I show up to a meeting space with you, I'm not like wrecked with anxiety?
Great.
So I think it's all of those things. And I know I can't give you an answer like that you like what can happen out of that and what can be done to survive. And this might seem trite, and I hope it doesn't land that way. You are here right now. You're like beyond survival because you're here right now. And I hope that you're here tomorrow. And it's like, what is it that you need from you as an individual, and what can you resource from the people who you are still in right relationship with in order to like restore what you need in order to show up and be able to be a part of this mycelial network that Adrienne is talking about? Because I wholeheartedly believe that in the dynamic between self-work and community care is that there's things that we can do and that we must do for ourselves as individuals, harkening back to Grace Lee Boggs and what she says about personal transformation. And there are also things that people can take up within community to help support all of us going through that personal transformation work.
That's right. That's beautiful. And I think the only thing I would add into it is this learning process around how fickle the truth is right now. So there's like it's like a very fragile, tenuous relationship to the truth. And I think this question, I love that line of like, no investigation, no right to speak, because I'm just like, I feel like we've gotten ourselves into a condition where we can't even, ask, right? So with what you're saying, it's like, oh yeah, I brought this and then they said whatever, and then I end up getting canceled. And I've talked to so many people who said, yeah, no one even asked me a question. Like people just all kind of were like, okay. So we doubt everything, but we believe everything. There's something going on inside of that that's worth some interrogation. And then I've also held the hands of multiple people who've gone through cancellation or call out and returning from that space. And a lot of it has been, you have to get to the community of people who are actual real people in real relationship with you, authentic relationships who know each other, who actually know each other and know you. Because the people who know you they'll know your heart. They'll know if you're committing to your healing process, and they'll help hold you on your journey. And if you're, I think that's one of the things I've had to learn, right? Is like when I started my sabbatical, I had one set of numbers of people who followed me. When I came back from sabbatical, it had doubled. And I was like, I'm not even on here. Something else is happening. But people are just now, I'm like, I don't know who all those other people are. Right? I'm like, when I left, I knew most of them. Now I don't know who these people are. And I think we're living our lives trying to be accountable to a faceless horde of, folks. And to me, part of it is we have to get back into community with people that are like, I can call you on the phone. I can ask you. That's what I did. When the piece came out and people started yelling at me, I was like, let me call people who know me on the phone and be like, yo, did I fuck up? How bad did I fuck up? What do I need to do? What do I need to learn? What am I missing? Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just one person I loved that could tell me. I needed like 3-4 people to all say the same thing. And I was like, I think I really did mess up here, right? I couldn't just hear it from strangers. And I think that's one of the things that feels really important to me too, is like strangers going to say what they say. That the move in groupthink is really present on the social media world. But in right relationship, we need to stay in real relationships that live offline and online. I think that helps. Cindy, anything you want to add on that before we move to the next one?
Yeah, so, I want to honor the work of Insight. I actually got to go to the Color of Change, and the Revolution Will Not Be Funded, and was formative for my own development. And I was also part of an organization called Generation 5, yes, which really began to do a lot of work around this notion of, transformative justice. And there's been much work it's been built on, a lot of the restorative justice, also work of Insight and many other folks, right? And yes, one of the things that we did at Generation 5 was really trying to think about how do you bring community organizing model to the issue of child sexual abuse, right?
That's right.
And part of that was we were trying to actually think about, like, not only how do you prepare people to deal and act around incidents of violence and abuse, but also how do you also simultaneously take on the conditions? And part of, and then how do you also that's where I got exposed to first somatic training and process, right? But this piece that I think we so desperately need are models. And so part of that, it was a short-lived experiment but we believed in a 5-generation strategy. Now, 5 generations is 125 years, right? And part of that is being able to think about how do you actually deal with the conditions that lead to these patterns and incidents of abuse. But first, it was to really name, like, okay, who are all the people? Impacted person, the perpetrator, and then bystanders. Yes. And one of the things we did was choose bystanders as, in this generation, as the agent of change, right? So Charlene, to say, like, what does the person witnessing do? And I think that people who witness, there's a lot of us who witness a lot, right? And many of us are complicit, and many of us are often the control or the abuse is also either impacts us directly or yes, very adjacent. But there's many reasons why I think the empowering of bystanders was so important, right? But I think the information, again, even in that work, we're like, okay, something happens. How do you collect information? How do you gather information? How do you immediately support the impacted person? Because that often actually, people skip over that, right?
They do.
People skip over that. And it's like, what do you need? And how do you need it over time? Because it will change over time. What you may say, what you need today may be different a year from now. And I think that part of that is like consistently asking, what is it that you need, right? And then really the empower the bystanders to act based on what the impacted person wants. And then really this question of accountability of the perpetrator, right? And one of the interesting things to me, one of the worst crimes is child sexual abuse. So there are multiple crimes. There's many crimes that are really bad, but there is a deep level of just fucking power and just abuse there in terms of that. And one of the things that many perpetrators, because we also did work with perpetrators, one of the biggest things that they said was that the loss of connection and the loss of community was the biggest sort of punishment for them, right?
Yes.
And I think that's so deep, right? And so part of what we can think about is like, well, if that is the thing that will make you sort of rectify your behavior or acknowledge the harm that you did, how do you create those processes, right? And what does that look like? And I think the most important thing is also, once, if there is that sort of recognition, that sort of change in behavior, it's not even just the apology, but it's important for whatever process to name an end, right? And I think we often don't often name end. When do you end, right? When is the moment of repair? Where is the moment of redemption and forgiveness? Because in the movement, I have seen people walk around with scarlet letters for the rest of their life, right? If they did some shit, right? And if they did some violation. And I think that we have to think about it's like the prison industrial complex actually ends a time, you know, and it says now you have, you know, for however fucked up it is, but there is something about you did your time, then you get to sort of have redemption. And I think we in the movement yet haven't come to that place. And what does it look like to, you know, not pull the trigger on somebody, because it's sometimes easier to pull the trigger on that person than actually deal with the ramifications of what the conditions that lead to that. So I think in political work, it's just, again, like, we got to name the problems. We got to deal with it immediately. We got to ID the steps for repair and what needs to be done to rectify it, and hold people accountable to their actions and behaviors, right? Not just their words, their actions and the behaviors. Because I believe in human development and I believe in transformation. And ultimately, we have to be able to give people an opportunity to change. And some fools ain't gonna change, right? Or it's gonna take a very long time. But I think the process is that we need to be able to name what that looks like and hold people to that. And the last time, but also say, okay, this is where it comes to an end, and there needs to be some level of kind of repair and community kind of coming together, or familial or organization, to sort of come to a different sort of a lesson and summation.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Charlene. I
just want to pop in. I really appreciate what you just shared, Cindy, and like, having been in the position of both leadership and like sitting in a room with a survivor, sitting in rooms with survivors, being on the listening end, and then having a membership base to go back to.
Yes.
And parse out what to say, what not to say. And also with the additional, like, the factor of social media and the internet and just how quickly shit flies.
Yes.
And then on top of the person who committed the act of harm or act of violence might do it again and has done it again, or we know they've done it again.
Yeah.
And it's like, how, and these are all quite like things that I'm like still trying to figure out, and even like be more gentle with myself about, is how will we have, what do we do with a generation of movement folk who have come in moments of great crisis, of urgency, of seeing like Black death, violence against Black people on the internet, on TV all day, deeply traumatized. Now we're in this pandemic, Black folks dying, Native folks dying, Black Native folks dying, Latinx people dying, everybody dying. People are just like deeply wounded in so many ways.
Yes.
What are the things that we can put in place? I'm still falling short in answering that. And I feel like I don't want to sell people a false bill of solution. And like, this is the way that we go about it. And if we do these things right, because I've done those things.
Yes. No, and I really appreciate you asking this question, Charlene, because I think this is the thing, is folks are like, how do we leap from where we are to the future? Like, how do we just, you know, I'm like, oh yes, we want to skip. You know, I think of it like when I say I'm going to have a 6-pack, and what I want to do is wake up and have the 6-pack, right? And I just would like not have to do all the different steps that would shift the muscle and shift the body and shift everything structurally in order for that to be the result. I think that that's where we are. We're in the place where we've said, we would like to, as a movement, be an abolitionist transformative justice location, right? A practice ground, so that we can bring that into the rest of the world. But I don't think we have gotten to the place of being like, and we're willing to practice, all of us are willing to practice. Now, there are people practicing, right. And the people who are practicing are now reaching the point where we can share out what we are learning. So Beyond Survival came out this year. Leah Lakshmi Piepzna Samarasinha and Ajiris Dixon wrote this book. Fumbling Towards Repair, which I already mentioned. The Critical Resistance website has tons of resources on it. Everything Mia Mingus does, writes, or thinks is a resource on this. And Miriam Kaba is writing another book that's coming out soon. Andrea Ritchie is writing a book on this. Patrice Cullors is writing a book on this. Like, people who have been in practice are now figuring out, like, how do I transmit that? And I want to share this because one of the questions was, what is the definition of principled struggle? And I am publishing a book in the spring called Holding Change, The Way of Emergent Strategy, Facilitation, and Mediation. And it includes a piece on principled struggle from Tanya Lee, because that's who taught me. And I was like, y'all need to hear it from this Black feminist. It'll set you free. But the definition as she taught it, and I literally have, like, this is how she wrote it up on the wall 5 years ago or whatever when we were in there. And I just walk around. This is always on my phone and always with me. So the definition: we struggle for the sake of deepening our collective understanding and getting to greater unity, right? It's not just to be right and make someone else wrong. We struggle for something greater than ourselves. We must be honest and direct while holding compassion. It's not enough to be honest and direct and an asshole, and it's not enough to be compassionate and be lying. You got to find the balance between the two. We have to take responsibility for our own feelings and our own actions, right? And again, somatic practice, go to Prentice's page and get your centering on, right? Get into where you can actually feel and handle your feeling so you don't try to outsource that onto someone else to feel. You seek deeper understanding. This is one of my favorite pieces. So you ask a question. You don't just read the headline and think you got it, right? You ask, I want to make sure I really deeply understand this so that I can take action and be responsible for it. And then you consider that this may or may not be the container to hold what you need to bring. And I think this is happening in a lot of our organizations. I'll speak about this in a minute. We're trying to create resources to help more organizations and movement places to move through these things. But I think a lot of our movement organizations are being asked to be therapy, mediation, accountability process, coaches, and prison guards. And we're not good at any of those jobs. And then the last piece is side conversations or one-on-ones should help us get to better understanding rather than check us out of the process. And one of the ways you know that is if you check the essence of it. Could I bring the essence of this back to our group for us to deal with as a group? And I think a lot of what we see happening now is we're moving off to the side to talk about how much better we are than whatever's happening over there. And we're losing hope in each other. So part of it is also that hopefulness, right? It's like faith or hopefulness or whatever it takes for us to stay revolutionary and radical, even in spite of the odds against us. And one thing I'll mention as a resource is I gathered a bunch of names of people who are willing to mediate movement conflict this summer and have been working it up into something that can be shared out. We partner with BEAM. So BEAM focuses on providing mental health and therapeutic and other resources for Black people. And so we're adding to their directory, Black mediation, right? Black people who are willing to mediate other Black people who are having a struggle, right? So that piece, I think if we can help hold the conflict, that'll also make it clearer when we actually are in a call-out moment. Because I still believe in the tactic of call-outs, right? I still believe when the power dynamics are such that you cannot actually have that direct one-to-one or a process, right? I still think we need that tactic. But right now the tactic is flooded with misunderstandings and conflicts and other things that could be handled in other ways. Abby was saying, where are those 5 points? So they're in the book that's coming out in the spring. And Tanya gave me permission to write that up. I also think I've written it up in different places on the internet. So if you Google my name, I'll try to find that. I want to check in with women and children first. Oh, it's on page 21. Thank you. I was like, maybe it's somewhere. It's all over here. The piece that's coming is like more in depth about everything. I know that we're a little bit past when you told us to start wrapping up. And I wonder if we have time for like one more question, because I'd like to ask one more question. Going once, going twice. Okay, so one more question. Oh, good. We can talk until 8:45. Gee, we're going to ask 3 more questions. If y'all are good, are y'all okay with it? Okay, so cool. So one more question that comes from folks here, which I think is actually really helpful, is it reasonable to have someone leave a position of power or a job that where they are causing harm, and then once they're no longer in a position, seek an accountability process for them in community? And what I hear inside of that is this a possible way to handle these things, right? Is remove people from a place where their power allows them to cause harm, and then call for some kind of community process. I'd love to hear if y'all have thoughts on that.
Did somebody plant you? Somebody tell you to come here and ask that question?
So there's more details here. So it's like someone in a master's program. Oh, you know this one?
I don't know about the master's program. I don't know.
Someone in a master's program, he emotionally abused multiple students in romantic and platonic relationships. And I mean, I can jump on this one because I've been in this particular circumstance where I was one of a group of people who were taken advantage of by someone who had more power. And I definitely thought it was the appropriate thing to ask that person to leave that position of power. I never at any point thought it was the right thing to try and destroy that person. That person was given the option to engage in a collective like community process, and they said no to it. And it was such an interesting process for me because I was like, well, what do I need as a survivor inside this circumstance? And what I needed was to know that this person could no longer impact me, and that the people in the movement in our space understood like this is how this person rolls, and they have not chosen to do anything around it. What I found interesting was that the person continued to do the things. And one of the things that Miriam talks about is like, you can't force someone to heal, and you can't force someone to be accountable. That there is an invitation. And even when we do all the calling out and the cancellation, you still can't force it. And often that actually sets back the process. If that happens earlier than maybe it should, then it can really set the process back a long ways. Because most people, when they get publicly called out, or even if your household, like most people, when I've been doing some little workshopping around this, I'm like, if you get called out in front of a group versus someone coming to speak to you privately, even every one of us knows the distinction. Like even if it's at the dinner table and someone's like, so you didn't flush the toilet. It's like, that is a very different conversation than if you had pulled me off to the side. And most people would prefer like being pulled off to the side. But there are people who are abusers, and they're manipulative, and they're sneaky, and they're like, oh, pull me off to the side. I'm like, bitch, you've been pulled off to the side 20,000 times. Now something else has to happen. I actually think it's really helpful to figure out ways that we reduce the power that someone holds, right? I'm like, that actually gets to a satisfying result, or a more satisfying result, because they can no longer just willy-nilly operate. And I think at all times the question we need to be in is, how do we break the cycle of harm, rather than how do we break this person, right? I'm like, this person, even the most egregious harm doer, there's a reason they're causing that harm. And there is some healing process that could help them. We may not know what it is yet, right? We may not have even created it yet as human beings. I think we are also figuring that out. It's like, this is on the front of my thoughts. I've been writing and thinking about this, but like, we need some spaces that bring together what we know from talk therapy, what we know from somatics, what we know from circle, like accountability circle spaces, what we know from relationship work. We need something that starts to bring more of these modalities into a deeper conversation with each other, because I actually think it's like something has to happen, mind, body, emotion, spirit, when you're that far out of alignment with the human condition. You need something that's going to really rewire you. And I think currently we don't have that. I really appreciate what you were saying, Charlene. Is like, let's not promise what we cannot deliver. Instead, I'm always like, but let's invite people to be practitioners of developing something that we will be able to deliver, or that the next generation will be able to deliver, right? As opposed to right now, which I think we are training people to, like dispose, and speed up the disposal process and speed it up. And, you know, one of the things I say in the book is I don't want us to be 5 people righteously standing together who've never caused harm ever. I haven't met anybody who's never caused harm. So I'm like, I don't want to be a solo radical. I really want to be in community with a bunch of human beings, which means people who've also caused harm. Cindy, Charlene?
I just had 2 things to add there.
Yeah.
One is that everybody is not going to necessarily, specifically referring to the situation that the person mentioned about the students and the professor. Given that this is more than one person, everybody may not be ready to come into an accountability process at the same time. The professor can very much so say, yes, I'm ready to do this. And the students who have been harmed in the situation can be like, or like one of them could say, yes, I'm ready. The other 2 or 3 can say, no, I'm not ready yet. Or they can all have varying like desires. And then the second thing I wanted to say, within context, in a movement context, I don't know how to relate this directly to like school or like in the academic sense.
Yeah.
But like how we communicate what is happening with the person who is being fired really matters.
That's right.
Because that's when, in my experience, rumors just flew. And I didn't have to say much at all for people to then create a story of their own. And it became a whole thing that was well beyond like my control as a person who was in a decision-making like position.
Yep.
And no matter what I did, well, I shouldn't say no matter, but even in spite of what I did, the situation, like, because what I can own is I didn't fully communicate very well what happened. And also I was in a situation of deep trauma and like one of the people was like fucked up in the head about what was going on. And so people in decision making and leadership positions aren't always the best equipped to figure out what to do to get out of the mess. Even when oftentimes in my experience as a Black woman, the responsibility is laid on my lap. And so I'm just speaking from some personal experience of how we communicate what is happening really matters, and that everybody may not be ready to do it on the same timeline.
That's powerful and important. And I think we have to also remember that we live in a culture right now that is obsessed with bad behavior. Like we love bad behavior and we uplift bad behavior and we can't take our eyes off of it. So, you know, recent examples, there was some show recently about a man who murdered his family, and there was like, oh, all these women are writing to him to try to connect with him romantically. And they were like, what is that, right? I think the reason we ended up with 45 in office in some way is that we can't look away from an accident on the road energy, right? It's just like there's something in us that is pulled or compelled towards the tragic and the harmful and the scandalous and all of it. And if that's our human nature, how do we not pretend that's not our human nature? I'm like, how do we give ourselves that in entertainment so that we can satisfy that and then start to actually hold a tighter boundary around it in movement space. That movement space should not be a space where we're like hungry for the next scandal, downfall, harmful situation, whatever it is, because people run towards it right now. I'm like, how do we get ourselves to be like, oh my God, everybody in that circumstance needs our compassion right now. How can I extend something rather than taking? Cindy.
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. I think that we need to be able, I'm so glad that all these feminist, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Arab sisters, PI sisters are writing books and documenting because there's been multiple generations of work around trying to think about transformative justice, restorative justice, a different form of justice. And I think we need to think about, even in our failures, and I've been part of processes of trying to hold comrades accountable where we failed. And to this day, like, I feel like shit about what we didn't do or what we did. And I think that, you know, and I think we've never, we don't speak about it, you know, so much, but I think it's in speaking from the lessons, from what to do, what not to do, and then what actually then did work, actually, you know, even in the failure, there's some things in there that I think are important to lift up. So I do feel like we need models, and we need to think about ways in which we practice those models, right? But at the same time, in that practice, ensure that you're not, it's like no one's disposable, right? It's the value and it's the intention of, you don't go in there trying to fuck up, but you go in there trying your best intention to resolve the issue and be able to say, you know what, we're fighting for you. And I think that's the thing. It's like, we're fighting for you. Right. And I think that's something that's so important.
Or just really quickly, Cindy, I want to make a note of that. So we need models. Yeah. How do we practice? Yeah. How do we document? And part of it is like, how do we recognize that we're in this learning phase, and there's going to be a lot more things that feel like failures, or things that feel unsatisfying, you know, or things that feel like, that's not what I thought it was going to be. But right now, we're creating a condition where we can't experiment at all, because no one wants to take the risk to do it. No one wants to take the risk to share it. No one wants to take the risk to be like unveiled and vulnerable that they fucked up and needed a process. Like there's actually so many examples and so few people willing to share them because of these conditions we're in, where it's like, if people find out I did this, then they'll cancel me. Right. Yeah.
Right. I mean, if we want a new society, it's going to be out of a practice of multiple failures, actually. So I think if we, you know, and I think that brings me to my other point, which I do feel like, I believe there's political differences in the movement. Yes. And there's a tendency between people who have a politic of construction and a politic of destruction. That's and right. I maybe get some shit for this, but part of this is that there's a politic of trying to actually, politic of power or a politic of victimization. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, do you actually want to win and transform? And do you actually want to actually be part of the revolutionary process? And people are afraid of power. And people are uncomfortable with power. And many of us in the movement are uncomfortable with power. And we don't talk enough about power, because ultimately, within that context, there's a lot of responsibility. And within that, there's constant navigation. There's a lot of actual compromise. And we see this in the United Front work. We see this in our campaigns. We see this in our day-to-day work, right, of building organization. Yes. And ultimately, if you make decisions that then don't fall in align with like the utopia of what we want, then you get people disappointed, right? You get people disappointed and you're like, you're not living. But ultimately, I think it's a more fundamental issue. It's a different political tendency, and I think we need to name it. And ultimately, it's like, if you really want to build and think of this, a systemic alternative to the current system, we want a paradigm shift at this moment. Yeah. Part of that has to be able to, how do we learn from the feminist movement? How do we learn from the indigenous movement? How do we, all these things have been coming to us, right? In terms of, we need to be in right relationship with nature. We need to actually center women and gender nonconforming people's needs. We need to defend Black lives. We need to defend indigenous sovereignty. All these things are coming out of articulations of the new world. But we got to move from sloganeering to actual practice. And that shit is messy, y'all. That shit is messy, and we have to be uncomfortable with we're not yet at the utopia. We want to get there. Yeah. But that's why we talk about in GGJ and CJ, and It Takes Roots, a just transition. because transitions are happening, but they're not always going to be just. And part of that is like, how are we in this process? And then how do we think about it over the long view? It's and that's why it's like, it's going to be 100 years, 125 years before we see a major revolution in this country, in this world, in our context. What are we trying to do in our like this decade? What are we trying to do in our generation? And I think be clear about that. And so if this is the moment of experimentation and this is a moment of documentation, then how are we then doing this work? And so not be afraid to tell the truth, not be afraid. It's not about being liked. It's about being trusted, right? And I think that's what's important, right? It's like at the end of the day, you know, I always think about that Audre Lorde quote about like, even if your voice shakes, and my voice hella shakes, I get red. Adrienne, you
literally
know,
are so, I love it. You're like, I'm fucking terrified. Here's the truth.
Know, but you got to say it. And at the end of the day, it's not about that, right? It's about being honest and being clear and being vulnerable about where we're at and not trying to paint somewhere where we're not.
I love that. And I think that this is where like the work of like how we transform as individuals, how we transform as collective, how we transform as community feels so tied together to me, because I feel like what I've been learning as an individual to feel like, how will I live a life that is worth living, that I feel good in? I have to learn to fight fair, right? I have to learn to not be manipulative. I have to learn to, like, in those moments when I'm full of rage and I want to like change the conditions, I have to actually expose that I'm hurt or that I could be hurt. I have to expose like that I have trauma, and it shapes the thing, like in a daily experience, someone can walk up behind me and it will put me into a different state, and I have to be responsible for that. And I think one of the biggest things is it feels powerful when you initially throw up borders, right? And I'm not talking about boundaries here. Like boundary is like, you know, I'm really setting a line. But the border is like when I think of like a border wall, right? Where it's like, no one can come over this. It initially feels powerful. Octavia Butler talks about this in the parable of the talents, and the parable of the sower, that walls are always temporary. Walls are always, the moment you build it, it is falling down, right? The moment you build it, it is falling down. It is going to be reclaimed by nature eventually, right? It has to be constantly held, constantly reinforced, constantly built up. And I see that happening, right? Where we think we're practicing power when we throw up these walls. And what we're actually we're giving ourselves the power to shrink and be stagnant. That's what our country is doing, and that's what we are doing, and that's what our movements are doing. And instead, it's like, it feels messier, it feels more chaotic. But what does it look like to take those walls down? Because they're not of nature, right? Those are not nature's boundaries. Nature's boundaries are water between two pieces of land, right? Or a watershed that tells you like, this is what can resource this area. I'm like, what does it look like to bring that practice into movement? To say, okay, something about these conditions is not nourishing, right? What would make it nourishing? There is a poison. How would we detoxify? The mushroom processes it all the way through until there is no toxin trace in the mushroom or the soil or anywhere else. How do we process the toxins all the way through us, rather than thinking we can build a wall between us and what is toxic or what is bad or what is, right, harmful? And for me, this piece of it of like, we can't afford in this political moment to be committed to a politics of getting smaller and a politics of closing doors and a politics of being less complex. We actually won't survive that way. And in this moment, we actually have to commit to more complexity, which means with being with people in a wider range of emotional state and a wider range of activities. And this is one of the things in the book, I feel like trying to draw this out, that I'm like, can you even discern when you're in a misunderstanding moment versus a conflict moment? Can you discern when you have a conflict with someone versus just you're in a contradiction that is actually bigger than, right? Like, I'm like, every movement space where you're paying, you're receiving grants from philanthropy while also being anti-capitalist, you're in a contradiction. And then that stuff starts playing out as if it's like, it's like, no, we're both getting checks here. How do we figure out our anti-capitalist politic inside this condition, right? Or that condition or whatever. So it's like, how can you figure out what the contradictions are versus actual instances of harm and instances of abuse? And really, like, even in the writing of this book, I had to get clearer for myself on what do I understand to be abuse when someone has more power and is manipulating my behavior through using that power and causing harm to me. Then what is harm? Oh, it's when the power actually might be an equal dynamic. It might be a different kind of power dynamic, but this person's not necessarily manipulating, right? They're doing something that is straightforward. I understand what's happening. So I was just trying to, like, how do we get clearer even on what's happening? And I feel like because we don't have shared language around these things, we haven't engaged in the practice of generative conflict and learning how to fight well and how to understand all this stuff. I'm like, how do we ever expect to get there? So a lot of the book is asking people, just reflecting on that, right? If you look back at the last 5 people that you participated in a call out or a cancellation for, can you quantify, or can you not quantify, but understand what were they being called out for? Was it a conflict? Was it an act of abuse? Was it an act of harm? Was it something else, right? I have a lot of people who've been reaching out to me who are like, this is making me rethink things that I engaged in, where we took someone out or took someone down, and now I look back at that and I feel really differently about how that went. I don't think it was a good idea. I don't think it was the right move. It doesn't seem to have created change. I'm like, it's only a failure if we don't learn from that, right? It's only a failure if we don't learn from it. If we learn from it, if we're like, okay, so then what actually happened? Where did we go amiss? Was it that we didn't have enough resources for the survivor? Or we didn't have enough resources for the person who caused harm, or for both of them? Did the community not have enough capacity to hold that plus all the other crises on us? Like, in this moment, the domestic violence levels are going off the chain. That means that's also happening in movement. And I'm like, how do we generate the capacity to address all the things that are happening right now? How do we become a movement that can generate those resources amongst ourselves and each other? It is relational. It is absolutely relational. The only answer that makes sense to me is all of us have to learn how to do this. All of us have to learn how to discern. All of us have to be willing to hold each other. Like, I think of that doula work. Doula used to be something that everyone did in the community, right? It's like someone's having a baby, everyone ran towards that house and was like, we're all going to help with that. What does it look like to feel that way? It's like something's happening. How do we all show up? Not show up to drag someone out and destroy them, but how do we all show up to be like, all the humans in here need holding. You take the ones who had this experience, we'll take the ones who had that experience, and between us, there will be enough. I believe that. All right, let's see if we have one more question here. Because we're getting to that time again.
Can I just say something? You know, I just want to normalize, like anger. You know, it's like it's okay to be angry, to be disappointed, frustrated, like piss the fuck off, cuss people out. It's okay. So that's not what we're saying here, right?
That's right.
So it's not to be like that. You're actually not actually full, like also sharing that. You know, that people can constantly, it's like, oh my God, there they go again. And they're doing the same exact shit.
Exactly.
Right? And so I think that I just want the takeaway. I'm
angry every day.
Yeah. I was like, anger is like my, like, cooking. I'm fight, like, you know, like I'm always in fight mode. And so to me, I want to just share that with people. It's not that we're saying that that's not, part of this process. In fact, actually, but I think it's what you do with it, right? It's like what you do with it, and then how do you navigate people in that shared anger? Because, you know, it's like, even like, you know, when we did work around child sex abuse, like vigilante, like, okay, normal, like it's normal, like you want to cut their balls off if they, you know, it's like all those things, those are normal. But it's like, what's actually going to deal with the condition is a harder question. And I think that's what I think we're pushing for, is like, how do we actually how do we prepare ourselves and come up with different models to deal with the incidents, but also how are we simultaneously undermining the conditions that keep that from happening? And I think time is different, right? Time is different. And I think you talk about this, Adrienne. It's like, here's the incident and what is the condition of satisfaction in that? But it's like over time, what are we trying to do, right? And so I just want to say that because I don't want people to go away with it like, oh, can I feel sad, depressed, angry, ripped? Like, no, absolutely. That's part of the process too.
It is. And I also think this is why, like, and this is the question I want to ask y'all, sort of like what you believe is possible in movement if we do commit to different practice. And for me, I think a lot of it is like part of what I think community needs to be willing to do is to say, I will go hold, and I can hold a survivor through the full range of their emotion, right? When I was in my survival role, I was so angry. I felt like I had betrayed myself. I'd let myself be betrayed. I was so, I wanted to blame everybody around me because I was like, you all watched this fucking happen and you let this happen. Like I needed to be held through all of that. And it came and went in waves and waves. And it was a while before I actually knew what I needed, which was boundaries, right? Really strong, clear boundaries that I could articulate and my community could help me hold. I needed to be able to feel that. But the person who had caused me harm, they needed a different group of people to be holding them and affirming their whole emotional process. And for them to get to be heard on like, where did this shit come from? Because we don't come out the womb like, let me figure out who I'm abused in this lifetime. So some things happen along that journey. And how do we actually create the space for being held? All right, so 4 minutes before they bump us off the site. So a sentence. What do you think has become possible if we commit to different practice?
What becomes possible when we commit to different practice is that in moments of high escalation, high visibility, and high attention and resources upon our work, like become a real thing for us. We don't fall apart. We actually blossom and we like advance on the things that we want to create for our lives and in the communities that we belong to.
Cindy?
I think something I say to our organizers is that, you know, we want to be fierce before the enemy and we want to be humble amongst the people. And I think that part of the humility is important to know what we know and don't know and what we can change and can't change. But ultimately, like, it's that constant, right? It's like, you got to be clear about who our enemy is. And we got to be clear about how we hold a different vision and that humility to know the difference, you know?
I love that. I love that. And feel free to throw your words and answers in the chat as we go. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight to be in this conversation with us. You could have been anywhere in the world and you chose to be here figuring out how we move towards abolition and freedom together. Cindy and Charlene, I want to thank you so much. I feel like smarter every time I'm near you and that you all take this stuff seriously and that you're in it, like you're in this work. And I just feel so honored to get to be in it with you and in conversations like this with you. And Women and Children First, I'm so grateful for y'all. Thank you for hosting this. I hope that everyone learned something.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say thank you, Adrienne. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you all so much. For everyone who's watching at home, the Buy the Book button is still live, and it'll be live until they boot us off. So if you haven't bought, we will not cancel us. Please hit Buy the Book.
Oh my gosh, I wish I had a camera.
Right.
I know. Oh, okay, hold it up. I can do this.
Buy the book.
2 hands.
I was like, buy this book.
I got it. I think oh, there we go. Boom. Okay. Okay.
So additionally, any of the other books that we mentioned, from Apologetic to Parable of the Sower, Parable of the Child, Fumbling to Repair, Love with Accountability, all of the titles that are mentioned, there are links in the chat box, so please use them if you are interested. We're probably about to get booed off. Again, thank you so much to our 3 speakers tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Cindy, for giving us your time. I hope everyone stays as healthy as possible and that we get to prioritize rest as we head into the end of this holiday season and the end of the year with people maybe not sharing resolutions this year. Maybe weight won't be on there, hopefully, you know. But Stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much, and have a great night.
Thank y'all.
You. Thank you. Good night. Thank you,
I'm like
women
so
and
excited to
children
be
first.
booted now. I'm like, what are they gonna? What's it feel
Right.
like to get booted?
Raven, the next time I see you, Raven, the next time
Yeah.
I see you, I just need to do better. I need to pay more attention. Did you change the phone? Are we still live? Dang, we're still live.
We're
Yes,
still
but
live.
y'all need to
This is
see
the
each
next
other.
time.
Well,
Y'all enjoy it. No, I think this is the first time we've met, and my hair has been straight. It is
Okay.
typically very curly and out and doing the things and the stuff. So
That's very cute.
well, thank you all so much. And also, buy Charlene's book, Unapologetic.
Exactly, Unapologetic.
We're still on the Zoom, girl. We're still on the Zoom.
They were like, maybe they'll kick us off at 9:46.
All right, I thought
maybe they don't want to cancel us, right? They heard us.
They were like, I guess we're not allowed to kick you off. No. All right. Well, we can just go, y'all, because we are free beings. We are amongst the freest beings that ever lived.
Good to see y'all. Thank you so much.
Love y'all.
Love y'all. Bye.
Bye.
Y'all.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.